The Iran-Iraq War is a turning point in modern history of the Middle East, and I would even argue it's as important as the Sykes-Picot Agreement decades prior. Not only did the war leave Iraq in debt to Kuwait and strengthening the Ayatollah's control over Iran, but sowed the seeds for the global war on terror, leading to the rise of ISIS and other terror groups. However, these events were not planned to happen, and it's still important to ask the question of, what if? And that's what I'll be doing today, for what if anyone won the Iran-Iraq War. The origins of this war don't exactly impact the outcome, but a brief overview is necessary to explain the goals for each nation. Iraq was ruled by Saddam Hussein, who was a part of the Arab Ba'athist movement, which combined elements of Arab nationalism and socialism. Iraq had a different variant, cleverly named Saddamism. Although there are many differences between the regular Ba'athism and Saddamism notably was much more opposed to Shia Islam than its neighboring states. It's much more tied to Iraqi nationalism rather than Arab nationalism as a whole. These clear distinctions paved the way for Iraq to claim the oil-rich regions of Khuzestan and the Shatt al-Arab waterway, which has been disputed between the two countries before the rise of Saddam and the Ayatollah. Iran, formerly the Kingdom of Persia, was ruled by Ruhollah Khomeini, who led a revolution against the millennia-old monarchy and founded the Islamic Republic, which was to be ruled by the Faqih, or clerics of Shia Islam, and then ruled by a supreme leader, that being Ruhollah Khomeini. In simpler terms, Iran was now under the control of a religious-backed dictator. The change of government in Iran shocked the world, both in the Soviet bloc and in pro-Western bloc, opening up a third front in the Middle Eastern Cold War. This Islamic fundamentalism was supported by a doctrine to spread the revolution into neighboring states, such as in Iraq, which is especially awkward as Saddam Hussein initially supported the revolution. With all this being said, war was imminent, and as the title of this video suggests, Iraq will win. But before the war started, a plot known as Saving Iran's Great Uprising, or the Nojea Coup d'etat, was an attempt to coup the new Islamic Republic and restore the Shah. The plan called for two phases, where the Shahid Nojea air base was to be captured and then alert the rest of the Air Force of a false flag attack in the west, which is why it's called the Nojea plot. The second phase then called for an airstrike from the base to hit targets in Tehran, such as the home of Khomeini, Mehrab Airport, the Prime Minister's office, the Revolutionary Guards HQ, and the Vala Irsir and Inam Hussein barracks. Then the capture of Tehran. Many sources claim that the conspirators had contact with Saddam Hussein and the United States, and they funded the plot. Although these sources are mostly Iranian biased, it wouldn't surprise me if this occurred. This also set the stage for the Soviet Union not supplying contracts to Iraq, which crippled the Iraqi oil industry in the early stages of the war. This had been tipped off by President Abolhassan Benazir while speaking with Soviet diplomats. Be that as it may, all of this needs to actually occur. From early July to August, the plot would take place, and the effects would alter the upcoming war, such as the plot wouldn't be successful, and in fact go so horrible that the leadership of the military, including conspirators, would be purged, just like in our timeline, except far more worse. According to globalsecurity.org and the post-revolutionary purge of Iran's armed forces, a revisionist assessment by George F. Rose, over 60% of the armed forces had deserted from the country, and at most 10,748 personnel had been executed. Doing the math, Iran's army had an average of 77,285 in 1979, and an average of 8,000 support personnel. However, if we take in consideration the amount of personnel lost during the Nojea coup, it could be higher, up to 20,000 executed or killed in action. In the following coup attempt, the final number would be around 26,114. Comparing this to the Iraqi army at the start of the war, which would be a ratio of 8 to 25 soldiers, although I wouldn't trust my math as it's not my strong suit. But in general, it would be they would lose a lot of manpower and instability in separatist regions. The Revolutionary Guards have more control over affairs concerning the army, and at first look of how the Iranian military would be able to face during a real war since the 1940s. This would be the first time Iran's new government would be tested by its own people, and already the Ayatollah's reign was crumbling. And then Iraq rocked the nation with a bombardment of attacks, starting the Iran-Iraq War. However, unlike in our timeline, the Iraqi ground invasion would start on September 22nd, along with the airstrikes. This is crucial, as the strikes barely scratched the grounded Iranian Air Force, and that one day gave them enough time to repair their airstrips. Without air power, Iraqi fighters and ground attack aircraft could be funneled into other battles, taking out helicopters and anti-tank weaponry, such as in the battles of Khorramshahr, where notably Iraqi advances had stalled till October from the use of chieftains and recoilless rifles. The initial advance would be followed up by failed airstrikes such as the Operation Kaman 99, Operation Sultan 10, and possibly the H-3 attack on Iraqi soil. But due to the Soviet contracts to air defense weapons not being null, this air supremacy would likely last till the end of the war. Although Iran would have supremacy in the Gulf following Operation Kafka and Operation Movarid, decimating the Iraqi Navy. With the Iraqis advancing towards Be'abane, Khorramabad, and Isfahan, the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, a leftist organization opposed to Khomeini and with ties to Iraq, would start a wide-scale riot, bombings, and chaos in Iran in an attempt to overthrow the government just like in our timeline, but would likely be far more destructive. By January of 1982, a failed offensive to liberate Khorramabad, conducted by the Revolutionary Guards, would further deteriorate relations between the Guards and the army, notably in the Junior Officers Corps, which had Tudeh Party cells. The Tudeh Party was a communist party which had been banned in '81. It was evident that the war would leave Iran as a rump state, if not totally destroyed. Therefore, Abu Hassan Benazir, the Mujahideen Organization, or MEK, the Tudeh Party, and the National Front would attempt to negotiate a secret white peace with Iraq, with support from the Soviet Union and the CIA, removing the Ayatollah and ensuring that the spheres of influence of pre-revolutionary Iran would be status quo ante bellum. During this time, another plot would also be unfolding, led by Saged Ghotzabandeh, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, a close advisor of Khomeini, and soon other army officers, leading to the Supreme Leader's death in April of 1982 and the end of the war. Without any warning, the death of Ayatollah Khomeini would shock the world, and whether the assailants were caught or not, power would be given to the moderately Islamist faction within the Islamic Republican Party, then meeting with Olof Palme of the United Nations to broker a peacefire with Iraq. The demands were simple: Iraqi annexation of Khuzestan province, the complete disarmament and peace between the two nations, complete self-determination of the residents in Iranian Kurdistan and Kermanshah through a plebiscite, and stationing of a peacekeeping force on the border of the two nations. With no other option, the now provisional Islamic government of Iran would accept the plan. Seeing opportunity for gains, the general left, comprising of the Organization for the Struggle of the Emancipation of the Working Class, the Tudeh Party of Iran, the Iranians People's Fedai Guerrillas, the Organization of People's Fedai Guerrillas, the Dangani branch, the Communist Party of Iran, and the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan would rebel. This force would be reinforced by the Soviet Union and former members of the Republic of Mahabad, the Azerbaijani People's Government, former members of the Communist Party of both those former countries, and would assert control over northwest Iran, proclaiming the People's Republic of Iran. This would mostly occur due to Soviet ambitions in the area, and Iran breaking Articles 5 and 6 of the Treaty of Friendship between the two nations from the 1920s. The impacts of this communist succession would impact another term of the treaty, that being the Iraqi-influenced Republic of Avroman, located here, comprising the complete area of Iranian Kurdistan and the city of Kermanshah. During the war, many groups sided with Iraq, including the Salvation Force, primarily made up of Kurdish members of the Naqshbandi order. Although in our timeline, the Salvation Force barely made an impact, I believe that if Iraqi victory occurs, autonomy or complete independence would pan out because of Izzat Ibrahim al-Dori. Al-Dori was one of the closest advisors to Saddam Hussein, and after the war he led the Faith Campaign, which led to greater amounts of freedom towards Islamist groups and members of the Naqshbandi order. Another thing to keep in mind is that this region also incorporates parts of Iranian Kurdistan, a region that's inhabited by the Kurdish people, who are distinct from the Persians by language, culture, sometimes religion, and are a stateless people. For over a century, the Kurds have advocated and sometimes fought for independence from various rulers, and this was the same for Iran, where the movement was spearheaded by the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan and the Kamala Party of Iranian Kurdistan. Although both of these parties were aided by Iraq during the war, Kamala was influenced by the Soviet Union, and was kind of a Kurdish branch of the two-day Communist Party of Iran. Meanwhile, the DPIK was more independent but had slight connections to the Iraqi Kurdish Party. This being said, this unholy alliance between the Kurds of Iran and Iraq would create a divide within the whole Kurdish independence movement, one allying themselves with Iraq to form a puppet state, and the other opposing Ba'athist Iraq and engaging in guerrilla tactics to open warfare, much like in our timeline, but I'll cover that later. The actual independence part is a bit tougher to answer, as yes, Iraq did fund the DPIK, yet I have found nothing about there being any plans for an independent state, although I would feel it would be somewhat similar to the 8-point plan presented by the party to the new interim government of Iran. On August 26, 1979, I haven't found any direct word-for-word article, but I have found many summaries, and to summarize these summaries would mean that the Republic of Avraman is essentially a puppet state with significant levels of autonomy for the Kurds and members of the Naqshbandi order. Now, this next independence movement is most likely not to succeed, but I believe it's still worth mentioning, and that's Balochistan. Balochistan is a region that is primarily inhabited by the nomadic Baloch people, and much like the Kurds, they are a stateless people and are distinct from the Persians. However, unlike the Kurds, Baloch nationalism is far less popular, with a report by the International News of August 13, 2012, saw that only 37% of ethnic Balochs within Pakistan and Iran favor independence. Reign of the Shah, Baloch nationalism was suppressed in Iran, and in 1974, many of the insurgents left for Afghanistan and Pakistan, one of which was the Baloch Liberation Front, a terror group that was active in fighting the Pakistani government during the 70s with support from Iraq and the USSR. This support was so large that a raid on the Iraqi embassy in Islamabad uncovered an assortment of small arms and explosives. I'll cover the impacts of the insurgents in Pakistan later, but this group in particular, led by Shir Mohammad Mari, Juma Khan Mari, Allah Nazar Baloch, would likely return to Iran and pursue an insurgency within the region, culminating in hit-and-runs to mass casualty terror attacks. A final effect of this war would be the seizure of Abu Masa and the Greater and Lesser Tunubs Islands in the Persian Gulf by the United Arab Emirates. Before the war, these islands were heavily contested and occupied by Iran. But with a weaker Iran and with support from Saudi Arabia, these islands could be retaken. Although these islands are very small, they are in the middle of the Persian Gulf, which is incredibly strategic to the many nations that have a coastline there. This would spark aggression from Iraq, and the United States would have to intervene, with U.S. warships being stationed there to protect shipping lanes. This would be the start of hostilities between the Gulf Cooperation Council and Iraq. As I said before about the Kurds, they are a stateless people who also inhabit northern Iraq. Now, in Iraq, the Kurds have almost always had a somewhat level of autonomy from Baghdad, whether that was wanted or not. The prime agitator for independence for a Kurdish state from Iraq was Mustafa Barzani and the Kurdish Democratic Party. The majority of support for the party came from the tribal inhabitants of the mountainous Dohuk Governorate. However, during the 1943 revolt, he gained a vast amount of support from the urban Kurdish class and left-leaning nationalists, including former members of the Iraqi Communist Party and Iranian Kurds from the short-lived Republic of Mahabad. With this influx of leftists within the party, Ibrahim Ahmed became secretary when Barzani was exiled to the Soviet Union. Ibrahim's influence on the party created a strong leftist faction, and with the 1950s oil boom, even more socialist support came from urban Kurds, and it made the most dominant party in Kurdish politics during this time, uniting the tribes of the north and the urban Kurds of the south. Although cracks within the party began to form when Barzani came back and distanced the party from the communism, angering Ibrahim and his successor Jalal Talabani. Then the Iraqi government went through a series of coups in 1963, and the party revolted against the government. However, Barzani signed a treaty with the government to end the war without informing the party. Then, in a power play, Barzani removed the leftists. And, to quote, "To legalize his own decisions within the KDP, Barzani coveted his own 6th Congress in Baghdad, where 14 of the former members of the leadership were charged with treason and expelled. allowing him to form a new leadership. It is possible to identify these events of 1964 as heralding the origin of the PUK. Then, after a series of failed agreements, the Kurdish Democratic Party was no longer a threat to the new Saddam government, and the main movement was now the PUK, or Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, led by former leftist Jalal Talabani. The only reason the KDP still exists today is because of the support from the Islamic Republic of Iran when the Kurds revolted later in the war. But with an early Iraqi victory, the existence of the KDP would be cut short, leading to the PUK taking its place as representative of the Kurdish people in Iraq. The relationship between Ba'athist Iraq and the PUK was very interesting. Both were leftists and both did not trust the KDP. It also encouraged unity between the Arabs and Kurds, or so they claimed. However, like the KDP, there were factions in the groups, notably three, one of which isn't all that important as all the members died out. But the other two were socialists mixed with Ba'athist sympathizers, and one was Maoist and friendly with the Tudeh party. In conclusion, the weaker KDP wouldn't have a say in regional affairs, allowing the PUK to sign a new agreement with the Iraqi government, allowing the provinces of As-Suleimani and Erbil to become a puppet state under the control of a coalition preceded by Hassim Akrawi under a revised agreement based off the 1971. The relationship between the Republic of Avermat and the PUK would also impact the new Kurdish state, as the PUK fought the Salvation Force during the war. Fighting between the two mainly occurred late during the rebellions, but Kamala fought them many times, seeing them as an enemy of the lower classes and as rich landowners. Meanwhile, the Salvation Front saw them as godless communists. Yet, some of the best PUK commanders, such as Ali Asghari, were a part of the Naqshbandi order, meaning the peace would be kept for now. The catalyst for a Kurdish civil war between the Naqshbandi, communists, nationalists, would not be opened until much, much later. With the end of the war, the contemporary history of the Middle East would be vastly different from that of our own. Notably, without the influence of Iran's Revolutionary Guards, terror groups that are infamous today would not be created, and the vacuum would bring in other groups, such as in Lebanon and Palestine. Lebanon is a country located in the Levant. It is culturally, racially, religiously diverse to the point where I'd consider a better definition of Balkanization than the actual Balkans. Sectarianism, an influx of Palestinian refugees, and the Cold War led to the country going into a civil war, although that's a vast oversimplification, as it was multi-sided and it lasted decades. Although we can see the impacts today with Hezbollah. However, what if I told you that Hezbollah had a chance of never even being formed? Hezbollah's support comes from the Shia community of Lebanon that had been marginalized as of the National Pact. The National Pact was a de facto way that the Lebanese government had allowed equal representation within higher positions of the government to be proportionally handed out to various religious groups in the country. Although once a small minority within the country, the Shia community then exploded in population. However, their representation in government wasn't changed, leading to the creation of the Amal movement, which was the first political party that mainly represented the southern Lebanese Shias. Unlike Hezbollah, they were influenced by Syria and were opposed to the PLO, and it wanted to reform or just abolish the confessional system of Lebanon. By 1982, Israel had begun to occupy southern Lebanon for fears of terror attacks coming from Islamist groups. In our timeline, this occupation lasted till 2000, as Hezbollah has begun to militarize significantly, using rockets to attack civilian targets in Israel. Although Amal did fight Israel, they were very insignificant. This could lead to a quicker de-escalation of the South Lebanon conflict and further expulsion of the PLO from South Lebanon, resulting in Israeli withdrawal from the region, only to be replaced with the Syrian army, which occupied Lebanon until the Cedar Revolution, which I'll cover later on the Arab Spring. Speaking of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, leader of Fatah, a faction within the PLO and one of the most influential and controversial Palestinian leaders, was one of the first people to meet with the new supreme leader in order to gain an ally and for Iran not to support rival Palestinian groups. Khomeini supported the PLO and called on all Muslims of the world to, I quote, to conquer Quds, or Jerusalem, sorry if I mispronounced that, and to, I quote, wipe Israel off the face of the earth. I do not condone that. That's what Khomeini said. and in return the PLO helped train the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Although things went south when Yasser Arafat negotiated with Israel in the Oslo Accords, which led to Iran throwing support for Hamas instead of Fatah. In this timeline, there's no doubt that the rump state that is Iran after the war would continue supporting Palestine, but very limited. However, the Soviet-influenced Iran and Ba'athist Iraq would not support Fatah instead of the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Minor Arab Liberation Front, leaving no room for the radical Islamist parties, for them eventually to fade away, including Hamas and the Axis of Resistance. Now, if we're on the topic of power vacuums, the biggest one that needs to be filled is the absence of the Ayatollah, which should be broken down like this. There are 6 main factions of the government: moderate Islamists, who want a democratic republic with an Islamic Advisory Council, and are far more liberal than the rest of the religious leaders in the Iranian Revolution. The Islamist faction are political parties that support Khomeini and are Islamic fundamentalists, wanting to spread the Islamic Revolution and want to keep the IRGC and the role as the supreme leader of Iran. They are led by Ali Hosseini Khamenei. The People's Mujahideen, which stayed in the Republic of Iran, is led by Masoud Rajavi, which wanted a democratic republic mixed with an Islamic one, and unlike the other left-leaning parties, wanted a free market economy, which is why they stayed in the Republic of Iran. The far right would be a minor faction in Iranian politics. In our timeline, Pan-Iranianism essentially died out when the leaders of the Nation Party, Darish Farouha and his wife, were killed in the Iranian chain murders, which were perpetrated by the Iranian government. But without these murders, the far right would continue to exist in Iran, and unsurprisingly be funded by the CIA. The Iran Party was a pre-revolutionary party in Iran, which was pro-democracy and nationalist, and wanted no interference from the Soviet Union or the United States. This ideology is also called Mossadegism, and would be led by Abul Hassan Banisadr and the Freedom Movement of Iran, which broke off from the Iran Party to actively fight the new government through resistance. They are Islamic liberals and Islamic Democrats, and are essentially led by Ibrahim Yazdi. These 6 groups would give rise to a new Islamic Republic of Iran, not governed by religious leaders, but by a democratically elected leader with an Islamic advisory, then with a democratically elected parliament. The first election would be held in 1990. Although I cannot rightfully predict who will win this election in our timeline, it's likely either going to be the Iran Party or the Islamic faction. But in both scenarios, Iran would be an isolated nation and improve on the economy through allowing other countries such as the People's Republic of China to be invested into the country, and negotiating with the United States to drop sanctions on the country. This would create a small economic boom in the nation, with its mining and steel sectors being the most lucrative, opposing our timeline's Iran with a successful oil production-based economy, and being allied with China rather than Russia. Speaking of, in 1991, the Soviet Union would dissolve, ending the Cold War. Countries once apart or influenced by the Soviets would now assert their independence and move westward. This would include Iran. The once dominant Tudeh party would fall to the overwhelmingly pro-Islamist groups, leading to the reunification of the Irans, although problems would arise, much like in other Soviet-influenced countries. Ethnic groups or minorities were often given autonomous area within the country, where the minority was now the majority, like for example in Romania with the Magyar Autonomous Region, or in Czechoslovakia with the Slovak Socialist Republic, and in the Soviet Union with the Yakut ASSR, the Buryat ASSR, and the Dagestan ASSR. It would make sense to assume that the People's Republic of Iran would also have an autonomous area, specifically for the Azeris, the Talish, the Tats, the Gilaks, Kurds, and possibly even the Iranians themselves, as the Azeris would have outnumbered them significantly, and this would cause a problem when it comes to integration. Azerbaijan, the primary fatherland of the Azeri people at this time, just came out of the Soviet Union and was headed by Abulfaz Elchibey, a fierce nationalist who in our timeline had aspirations of achieving a greater Azerbaijan by annexing portions of Iran and deterring Iranian influence by denying them oil. Abulfaz never succeeded in these goals, as he was later overthrown by Haydar Aliyev, who was backed by Russia, because of Azerbaijan fighting Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh. In theory, Abulfaz could achieve a victory or at least a more favorable position for a ceasefire if he annexed southern Azerbaijan by gaining more manpower, political support, and a vital trade partner in need of their oil. In 1993, Iran would cede southern Azerbaijan to Azerbaijan proper, and Abu Faz would unlock the formidable nation of Greater Azerbaijan in the Decisions tab. That is the dumbest joke I've ever made. Oh my. The impacts of this would delay Armenian offensive into Azerbaijan and the coup attempt to be fruitless. Armenia would be left with an agreeable amount of land, and Azerbaijan would be left almost 2 times larger after the war, and technically losing the war. Going to Iraq, Saddam's victory over Iran would bring concern from the international community, notably by Israel, Pakistan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. Saddam's territorial ambitions had yet to be settled. His encouragement of rebels in the Baloch region of Pakistan could interfere with Pakistani attention to the war in Afghanistan, if Saddam truly wants an allied country in the eastern Persian Gulf, which would make sense as Iraq is now potentially blocked off by the UAE's seizure of the Abu Masa Islands. Saddam's support with the terror group Abu Nidal would also be an alarm, being one of the speaking points of Ronald Reagan, with Iraq being classified as a state sponsor of terror and being a threat to Saudi Arabia. This could activate the Carter Doctrine, which would allow the United States to use military force to protect their interests in the Persian Gulf region. The United States' response would be similar to that of the 1986 Libya bombings, with airstrikes on the Iraqi military. The effects impacted on Israel and Palestine would of course be the lack of Islamist political groups, filled in with far leftist groups, which then allows a gateway for Syrian influence in Palestinian politics. Already, Arafat's control over the PLO was loosening, and a turning point would be various terrorist attacks committed by the Palestinian Liberation Front and Popular Liberation Front for Palestine, which would tarnish the PLO's recognition of a legitimate representative of the Palestinian cause. This contrasts with our timeline, as peace negotiations had ceased, with the PLO not condemning PLF attacks on Israel. The PLO would maintain its promise to United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 and 338, and expel these groups from the PLO, the consequences of which would be in Palestinian breaking out into civil unrest and a power struggle between the Syrian factions, Iraqi factions, and Fatah in Israel. Airstrikes from each country would be devastating on Israel. Their response would be offensive in the Golan Heights and strafing runs on Iraqi military bases, and a permanent solution. Also, side note, this is the most unrealistic part of the scenario. Like, I know people are going to say this in the comments, but Israel working together with Palestine to combat leftism, probably something you'd see in, not on a YouTube video. I just want to point that out. Super unrealistic, but maybe. Operation Bramblebush was a real plan devised by Israel to assassinate Saddam Hussein in 1992. After Iraq launched missiles into Israel during the Gulf War, although this is probably the most fictitious event in this timeline, it's the most interesting response Israel could have dealt with in this scenario. With that out of the way, how would Operation Bramblebush proceed? There were plans for a satellite to crash, and when Saddam would visit the crash, it would also explode. A plan for a television set to be sold during a broadcast and also explode. And my personal favorite, a statue would be staged to fall on Saddam Hussein during a ceremony. Yeah, that would do. So after Saddam Hussein is squashed, his heir Uday Hussein would take power as the 6th president of Iraq. And a little fun fact of Uday Hussein is that he was a literal psychopath, responsible for... I'd recommend watching Disturbing History's video about Uday for more information. His regime would be characterized by kidnappings, terror attacks, heavy authoritarianism, and the renewed research of nuclear weapons. September 11th is a turning point in the Middle Eastern history, even if it never took place in the Middle East. Planned by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, the attack left America in shock, mourning, and vengeful. An international coalition of 170 countries took place in fighting terrorism, and even today, in 2025, the United States is still committed to fighting the good fight, except that time in 2003, 2011, 2022, and 2021. As you may or may not know, the United States and allied countries launched an invasion of Iraq in 2003, with the false justification of Iraq owning weapons of mass destruction and supporting Al-Qaeda. But what would the early 2000s look like in our timeline? Uday Hussein had yet to cement his control over Iraq, having to rival his brother Qusay Hussein who had the support of the Republican Guard and the Hussein Fayyahdin. To gain an upper hand, he would appeal to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1441, supporting, with huge air quotes, multi-party democracy. To win over the people, Uday would do a number of things: convert to Shia Islam, which is actually historically accurate, control the state news channels and newspapers to appeal to the youth of the country by showcasing Western media, and turning his image of a cruel dictator into an everyday man fighting against his brother's bureaucracy. This race for support from members of their own family, the influential cities of Mosul and Tikrit, and the two Kurdish parties in Iraq and other future combatants will lead to factions emerging with Iraqi politics: the Neo-Baathists, led by Uday, and the Conservatives, led by Qusay. The exact breaking point could be the 1999 uprisings in Iraq, where mass protests against the government for anti-corruption and democracy would be met by security forces. Uday, seeing a chance to remove his brother from the picture, would back the protesters, plunging the country into civil war, which would then spill over to Syria, Iran, and Kurdistan. Out of this chaos would emerge jihadist groups, such as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Shia Islamist groups such as the Mahdi Army and the Badr Corps, and Kurdish groups including the resurrected KDP and the Naqshbandi Army. In October of 2001, in accordance with George Bush's 20th September address to Congress and his October 7th address to the country, Operation Enduring Freedom would commence, with objectives spanning worldwide, including Iraq. To stabilize the Middle East and protect U.S. interests in Israel and Saudi Arabia, the United States would enforce United Nations R2P doctrine by assembling a multinational coalition. In the South, MI6 of Great Britain and the CIA would seep into security forces of Uday's regime, using moles like Ayad Alawai of MI6 and Mohammed al-Shawani of the CIA to take control from within, to allow coalition forces to invade Iraq and have no opposition, ending the regime Uday insane. To the east, Iranian and KDPI forces would attack the Republic of Afghanistan and the Naqshbandi army, with the support of local Shiite militias, and to the north and west, Kurdish revolts, to which Turkey would react with intervening in Syria, supporting the Free Syrian Army, leading to the collapse of al-Assad and ending Russian influence in the Middle East earlier than in our timeline. In conclusion, the Iraqi civil war and its spillover would result in Western intervention in the disestablishment of two authoritarian regimes in the Middle East by around 2003 or 2004, with administration and occupation lasting for around 2 to 3 more years, changing the geopolitical landscape of the early 21st century. Comparing maps of the Middle East before the Iraqi civil war and after will showcase broad changes to the borders of the region, with Iran recovering some lost territory from Iraq, and for the first time in history, an independent Kurdish state. Syria's control over Lebanon will also fall, with the Cedar Revolution and the fall of Assad. This in turn would be the starting point of an earlier Arab Spring, or mass demonstrations across the Arab world protesting against corruption and authoritarianism. However, it would be far more different, as the internet, which played an important role, wouldn't be as developed until much later. So it's an interesting contrast between countries that had a successful shift in government versus unsuccessful shift. This would also impact future demonstrations in elections of Arab countries in the future. Israel and Palestine's history would also be changed significantly after the previously mentioned power struggle between Fatah and rival groups. Israeli support for Fatah as a legitimate government would be a turning point in their histories, with potential room for collaboration and negotiations amid the conflict. Later in 2000, the Camp David talks could be successful, with the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem being returned to Palestine if the gaps left behind by the former parties in the PLO were filled in with moderate ones, which is likely, thus securing a peaceful future in Israel and Palestine with no infidada, and Ehud Barak of Israel winning the 2001 Israeli prime minister elections. This could potentially delay Israel's government shift towards the far right and populism into a more center-right position. I'd like to go into more depth, but considering I've been holding this video off for months, I feel like it's a good way to end it here. Thanks for sticking with the channel, as a lot of things happened between this upload and my last one. I needed to be taking priority over this video. I'm sorry. If you liked this video, feel free to leave a comment and share some critiques and criticism of the video, as I'm always trying to improve my work for the viewers. And a final thing is thank you for watching.